Bustos, who is a clinical psychologist from Chile, who currently teaches research in entheogenic shamanic traditions here at CIIS. For over 15 years, Susana has focused her work on indigenous and mestizo healing practices from the Americas and their therapeutic use and value for the West. She has been a therapist research at the Takiwasi Center for the treatment of drug addiction, which integrates indigenous and Western medicine. She was a supervising therapist there, and she holds a private practice in Berkeley. Howard Kornfeld, who is next to Susana. Dr. Kornfeld is a clinical faculty member at UCSF and has been so for over 20 years. 20 years. Is the founding medical director of Recovery Without Walls in Mill Valley and the pain clinic at Highland Hospital in Oakland. He is a specialist in emergency addiction and pain medicine, and he convened the Pacific Symposia on Psychedelic Drugs at Esalen Institute back in the 1990s. And then next to me here is Tamara Rutherford. She is a certified professional co-active coach and the founder of Inner Life Explorations in Santa Barbara, California. Tamara's focus on consciousness exploration has led her to conduct extensive research in Mexico within the Mazatec tradition, which uses psilocybin mushrooms for healing and awakening. She has particularly focused her study on the tradition's practice of integrating entheogenic experiences. So can I have a round of applause for your panel? So we've done some prep for you, and we have a few questions we'll be going over together. And I'm going to read them out for you and for the panel. And we'll start by really launching into one over the others, but then we'll somewhat move randomly through these questions. As you all know, that's how we'll do it. You can take on any one of these questions that particularly move you or you feel you have something to offer, and we'll get into a dialogue together. And at some point we will stop and we will then take your cards and the panelists will answer your questions, as many as we can with the time allowed. So these are the questions they will be working with. What similarities and distinctions do you see among healing, the betterment of well people, and esoteric forms of spiritual exploration and development? I'll read that again. What similarities and distinctions do you see among healing, the betterment of well people, and esoteric forms of spiritual exploration and development? Second question dives deeper. When non-dual experiences occur in therapy, would people who lack a cartography, for example, as imparted by a mystical wisdom tradition, be disadvantaged at all in their capacity for integration? So the second one is about non-dual experiences and whether having a cartography or not to understand what's happening advantages or disadvantages the person having that experience. Third, if so, if there is a disadvantage, how can a suitable framework be developed for that person who is without a cartography? Perplexing question philosophically, isn't it? If so, how can a suitable framework be developed? And lastly, we'll engage this question, or any number of us will. Looking ahead to expanded legal use, what practices do your esteemed panelists see as complementing psychedelic therapy, and why? Last one, looking ahead to expanded legal use, what practices do the panelists see as complementing psychedelic therapy, and why? So to start us out, I'd like to just launch into whatever Bob might want to share with us about the first question and how that lives for you. And then I think that will help the panel take pieces of whatever you say and move with it.
How does this live with me? By esoteric forms of spiritual exploration, what comes to mind for me are Sanskrit and Pali words that I can hardly pronounce, much less understand. There are cultures that have developed very rich maps of consciousness in different ways into them and out of them. They've identified traps to avoid, and speaking for myself, I'm mostly ignorant of them. So my personal relationship to it is to think, wow, there's probably so much further that I could go if what I wanted to do was explore the nooks and crannies and layers and perspectives of human consciousness. And I wonder what the utility of that is. I'm not there, so I'm not quite, I lack the motivation to go very much deeper until somebody presents it to me. So that's one personal reflection. With respect to healing and the betterment of well people, Stan Grof has this wonderful term, holotropism, by which I think he means growth towards wholeness. And I love it because it seems to transcend both healing, therapy, betterment, the development of pro-social values and behaviors, generosity, forgiveness. It may be Pollyanna-ish, but I think I'm not alone in believing that that's a really important and possibly a dominant part of a liberated human consciousness. So there's a way to see them as really on the same spectrum. I'm also aware that in this culture at this time, those two things are typically guided, taken up by, administered by very different guilds. There's the medical guild, and there's a thing they do. And then there's guilds around coaching, and that could include athletic coaching. It's just, here you are, you're well enough, and we're going to get you better in some domain that you want to be. It could be singing lessons, could be relationship counseling. So the guilds are different, even though it's all holotropism.
All right, you got a lot to work with here, dear panelists. Would anyone like to respond to what Bob said or take us in another direction?
One of the things that I have been reflecting, while you were speaking, and when you were giving also that example of ayahuasca, the 30 centers, is coming from traditions. My path has been like encountering traditions, and then from my Western perspective, and then slowly like sinking into understanding a little bit of what's happening there. What amazes me is like how, and this is a paradox, and I don't know if I have that very very well articulated, but how in the isolation of chemical substances that we're doing, we go back into interconnectivity again, which is where we're coming from shamanistic cosmologies. We're coming from interconnectedness. We're coming from, for example, when we use ayahuasca, right, in vegetalismo and mestizo tradition that I follow, or when we use here peyote, we're not just using a substance, right? We're using many plants. There is a comprehensive understanding of when to use it and why, and what is sustaining it in a particular way for somebody. Sometimes it's more complex and sometimes it's not that elaborated. It depends on the tradition, right? So what comes to me is this idea of interdependence and interconnectedness that we're coming towards by contracting or isolating, coming back. So if we are reintegrating into wholeness, into holotropism, right? What are we then asked to do in order to do good integration work? So maybe it's not just to stay there, and I take what Bob is saying. Maybe we do need to work on community building, but community building maybe it's not just the thing. it's not anthropocentric in that way only. Maybe there are other things that we need to include when we do integration work, other sentiences that are there that we become aware when we do the work. And how do we do that in a coherent way? Because we go down to the cosmologies and it's more articulated. You know, there are ways, there are politics, ethics of relationships that happen. You know, here we are reinventing ethics of relationships. So just a few thoughts.
Anyone else?
Is this on?
Mm-hmm.
My interest is also in the integration. And when you refer to the non-dual experience, how to integrate that if there is no, as you said, no cartography. I think what we're seeing most often is people are having experiences that even without any point of reference that's spiritual or religious is some sense of awe, oneness, lack of separation. And in our culture, creating integrated experiences to deepen and further and express that sense of connection is, I think, the challenge. And so we have a unique community here where we speak the same language. But if you have someone who's had this unique experience, where do they go to speak about this? And how can they be encouraged to tell their story, to explore its meaning, to find community of people who can take it even deeper? And I think that that's the challenge, whether or not the context is betterment or healing, something from the DSM. Is working with community, and how do we speak about this, and where is it safe to speak about this?
Susanna, you said something I want to pick up, and you said it very respectfully and quickly about if we were to integrate community, and it might be beyond our particular species. How would integration into wholeness be not just for the individual? What would that look like? I don't know if that's where you were going, but that's where I went with it.
That's a very good question. One of the things that I have worked in the Peruvian Amazon for some years as a psychotherapist, and when I see this is interesting. When you see the identity of people down there, you can never apply like traditional psychotherapy with them. You cannot, because the identity, and I discovered that by failing, making mistakes. It's in reference. So the identity is referential to others, to the environment, so you cannot say, by the way, how to define yourself? What's the image you have about yourself? Because when you say that, they would look at you and say, So means like, what are you talking about? So there is like they would talk about their relations, in that way. When we work with sacred plants, the plants tend to show themselves as entities. I don't know if you have had that experience, but maybe also, and that's not my specialization, with psychedelics, it might happen that, we start entering into a relational field, right? Where, we can talk about like different things, but I think that psyche really works with interrelationships, like works with whatever. I don't want to say that everything is a psyche. I want to honor that there is a possibility that we have a multiverse here, and that we relate with each other, really. Like, that's the idea, that we acknowledge that diversity, right? So, there is, for me, like, just starting to think of an entheogen that you're relating to respectfully. That you get talk and dialogue with. That you can. That's one thing. Maybe the beginning. I don't know. I was working with some women this morning, and they were using tobacco for purging purposes, right? And how they relate to the tobacco while they are working through that. And we were doing it, working in a creek, because, the creek helps with washing the things away, So how do we relate to the creek when we are there? And it's just, this is mental, right? But what happens there when you are there is that there is already an honoring of the different sentiences in different degrees and with different bonds of relationship, it evolves. So I don't have an answer. I just what I see is that when we engage in entheogenic practices and psychedelic practices, there is an acknowledgement of ecological issues more and more and deeper and deeper. So if we are going towards there, starting with rebuilding communities, among humans, and then, relating to larger sentiences and to our connection, as mammals. Guess what? We're mammals. Then maybe things can include, we're going towards wholeness there,
And thereby perhaps sustainability on this planet that is in grave danger. Thank you. We could move on to the next question, or I could ask you, which I prefer to do, which of these other questions would you like to jump into? There's the one on non-dual experiences and lack of cartography or presence of it, pros and cons of both, or looking ahead to expanded use, what kinds of complementary practices would you foresee being essential or preferred or at least interesting? And Howard, you might be able to say something about that from Esalen.
Well, what I'd like to get your permission is to just segue on the word sustainability before we get into that. And I want to be mindful of what Bob, the story Bob was talking about with the ayahuasca enthusiasts. And the words angel's fear, come to mind. And in fact, someone named Gregory Bateson, who was also kind of an elder, his last book, co-authored by his daughter, was called Angel's Fear, Towards an Epistemology of the Sacred. And so I want to just go out a little bit on the branch of the sustainability question, and basically, how does this relate to everything else in the world going on? And when Bob says, what are the dangers, of this field, of course, the world is full of dangers right now, as well as healing nodes of emergence, which perhaps this could be called one of them. So, of course, there's nuclear dangers of war. There's the climate change. Something a little more directly the healing. I think we're looking at epidemics. We have the Zika going on now, and Ebola was just a year or two ago. Our society's not able to deal with these things in quite the same way. We don't have new antibiotics coming out, it turns out. People who've studied antibiotics are quite explicit. We are not inventing new antibiotics for a whole host of reasons, partly that it's not profitable, but partly because we're getting to the end of that strategy, and new healing methods, new public health methods need to be invented. And our drugs, whether they be antibiotics or our drugs for the psyche also, they're not working. And the psychopharmacology pharmacopoeia is can be seen as more and more bankrupt. And we're in the middle of an opiate epidemic right now. And that's an area that, although I was kind of sent to Esalen by another elder named June Singer, who was a Jungian, and I was embraced there by various people like Dick Price, whose name was on there, and an older fellow who made tapes of everything named Paul Herbert, and so I got the opportunity to be involved in organizing back in the 1990s this group of pioneers who were doing some of the initial research, and I met Bob at that time. But the psychedelic reemergence, the renaissance, without becoming manic about it, you know, is obviously an incredibly needed salve, or hopefully more than a salve, hopefully a deep healing development. And we're talking about emergence of this, and the word emergence is also maybe very important, because this pharmacopoeia that we have does not engender emergence. And yet all life could also be visualized as emergence. And in fact, the dogmas of biology are changing as we speak. As we perhaps switch from a kind of pharmacology that is a controlled pharmacology to an emergence pharmacology, biology is shifting from the so-called central dogma of biology, of genetics, where everything was determined by the DNA, and that determined the RNA, and that determined the protein, and with these tools we could control. And now it's understood that DNA is actually a read and write information storage organelle. And that's what's happening at the deepest levels of biology, fitting right in with perhaps the emergence paradigm of psychedelics, because with psychedelics you can't control what happens. All you could do is let the healing emerge from the patient, from the client, the subject. So I'll let you keep probing us on more practical matters, which I'll be happy to talk about also.
Oh, I was fascinated by that, because one of my favorite books, and many of you in the room have read it, is The Cosmic Serpent by Jeremy Narby. And Jeremy Narby would take what you were saying to multiple iterations, including that the presence of psychedelics on the planet is to enable evolution, and that there's a synergy between the DNA and the psychedelics. He's not here to speak for himself, but I'm glad to call him out. So thank you, Howard. I wonder who wants to take us somewhere next.
So this last question, this may be a little bit off, but I'm looking at the expanded legal use and what are ways to support that. I think about context. I think about the context for psychedelic work, particularly considering what you're saying about our problems with painkillers and opiates and addiction. And there is a view of something is broken, and I can take something and I can fix it. And that can translate to psychedelic use as well. That there is going to be this one superior, amazing experience that is going to fix everything. And I think that part of our responsibility is creating a larger context for what is possible through the work, what the progression of that work might look like, what are the integrative acts and systems that support in between psychedelic work, from meditation to holotropic to body work to nature practices, but holding that this work from the context of healing or betterment, of wellness, is a path, and being realistic about what is possible through it and what needs to be done to support it, that it's not a passive act, right? What emerges, emerges, but then there is action.
And integration.
Yes.
You want to say a little bit more about integration?
Well, I think about integration in two ways. There's the personal and specific. Something emerges, some kind of insight has occurred, and there's the application of it to the person's life. And so identifying those specific actions. But the other is what I was talking about before, is community, is the telling of the story, is the constantly contextualizing. And again, we have to have a place that we can tell the story, so it's not happening in a vacuum. So I think there's the community aspect of integration, and then there's the personal aspect of integration. And anything that can be done to emphasize that what happens in between psychedelic experiences is the thing.
I love that. Two comments. In psychedelic therapy circles, I've occasionally heard conversation about what does integration look like. In a research setting, somebody has the prescribed number of sessions. Do they see the therapist or the sitter twice after that, a week apart, or 3 times, 2 weeks apart? It's got some finite endpoint. And I realize why that has to be, and I realize why, for the purposes of the study or for therapy, that's often the right question to ask and is appropriate. There is an endpoint. There's another view. So far as I can tell, integration lasts a lifetime. If your worldview admits of it, I'm not saying that mine does, maybe it takes multiple lifetimes. Integration is like never over. So with that in mind, I would love for you to describe what you mean when you use the phrase intact community.
Yeah, working with intact groups.
So what is an intact group?
Well, a group that's come together already for some purpose. Perhaps it's a meditation group or a women's group, men's group. Some particular area of both developing relationship, but that relationship as a tool for going deeper into wholeness and discovery. And so, if we think about traditional psychedelic use in indigenous culture, the culture itself is the integrative community, right? We all live together and see each other, witness each other, point at each other and tell the truth to each other, and we assume that that's all happening. But now you take it out into this world, and where are these small communities to hold what's actually been revealed? Who do we have to be our mirrors and to point us out and to invite us, much like you said, Bob, at the beginning. Like, I will tell you, I will lean in, and I invite you to lean into me too. That takes community, and that is an integrative system, and that's what I'm in support of. So wonderful for betterment of wellness, for intact communities to approach psychedelic use to deepen whatever it is they're after.
Would you like to comment on that yourself?
I don't think I can better what Tamara said. When I think about the full emergence, the full unfolding, Howard, of any kind of growth experience, but particularly the non-dual experience, it shows up in every facet of life. And not every facet of life shows up where most of us work, or in the therapy office, or in any restricted domain. It takes place everywhere. Romantic relationship, friends, driving on the highway. These are all the nitty-gritty tests of where are we and what have we learned and where are our sticking points. It's a very comprehensive thing that we're looking at.
Susanna, are there any observations from your work in Peru and communities there that you'd like to share?
Maybe just think of how different it is to be an individual in psychotherapy, right? Than to be part of a therapeutic community. Like Takiwasi, for example, we have, and people live there for 9 months. So they go through all the work together, and they work together, they do ritual together, they bake bread together, they have, this group processing of experiences, they have individual processing of experiences, they have ritual that is not entheogenic, that happens too, that's part of it. They have service, they have tasks of service. How different it is to think about an integration that is held in so many areas, in that way. Taking somebody from their lives, outside of their lives, right, for a period of time, and then slowly supporting their reintegration into larger society. And that's probably not what we are gonna be facing here in the way that we're conceiving, psychedelic psychotherapy. So what you were saying, I think it's key. How do we have reference, groups from peer supports, to maybe more specialized, and how can we also identify criteria of like, what does a person need at a particular moment? Maybe it's necessary to work with spiritual emergency, so where are the people, that know, and what are referral systems, maybe there are energetic imbalances, that need to be addressed. So where do we go? Who diagnoses that after, a session? Or so the generation of a network of this is what excites me. I don't think it's possible to think of an individual integration. We need to include it's kind of like raising a child, that you need to include all these people. Kind of how we need to be intertwined in order to sustain those who go through it, and ourselves in that way.
What I'm hearing is a theme about really the compartmentalizing in the program as we've created it here at CIIS to train medical professionals and therapists to do the work. I'm hearing a theme here that I'd like to draw out, that in the long run, that is not sustainable. For community, we all need to have some aspects of the expertise that you four are talking about here. Why not have every member of the community know about integration, sitting, knowing how to go in and out of feelings, taking the role of the shaman of the moment? What kind of being would that be like?
I think that the through line for all those questions for me is, again, from the non-dual, like the non-separate experience, to community and integration. The whole work points to a healing of separateness with nature, with our families, with our communities, within ourselves. That is the possibility, the biggest door opening that there is.
Thank you. I think this might be a good moment for me to ask if there are cards to be had with questions, and if not, can you pass them to the sides here if no one's picked them up for you yet? And we'll start moving toward questions from the audience in a few moments. Is there anything we've said so far that one of you feel the urge to say something about? Anything piqued your interest that you don't want to let go?
Well, just to mention the opiate issue again, and the opiates are, of course, an herb. There was the first drug to be extracted from the actual opium poppy, the plant, by Western science, and right now we're in a reemergence of public health around opiates, perhaps a renaissance of treatment for opiate addiction as the epidemic has grown. The quote drug czar, who doesn't want to be called that anymore. Mr. Botticelli is a public health oriented a leader for the first time, someone in recovery, someone who's gay. And there's a softening of the war on drugs, and yet there's always the possibility that it could turn the other way, just like Bob said with psychedelics. I use a drug called buprenorphine to help opiate addicts, and the buprenorphine can be misused and it can cause harm. So psychedelics will eventually cause harm, and somebody eventually will make a bad outcome. But the general trend is waging peace in this war on drugs. Bob has done so much at Hopkins, and just yesterday there's a new effort at Hopkins that I don't know if many of you have heard of yet, but a group of researchers, this is an article in the Washington Post, top medical experts say we should decriminalize all drugs and maybe go even further. A group of 20 medical experts convened by Johns Hopkins University and The Lancet, which is the most prominent medical journal in England. And The Lancet have called today for the decriminalization of all nonviolent drug use and possession, citing a growing scientific consensus on the failures of the global war on drugs. The experts further encourage countries and U.S. states to, quote, move gradually towards regulated drug markets and apply the scientific method to their assessment.
Oh. So we did not glance much on the non-dual question. I wonder if anyone has anything to say about that. Because it's related to your point, Bob, about perhaps psychedelics eventually will not be so necessary. We might take them for only sentimental reasons. What a dream of humanity that is. So what do you think about the place of occasioned mystical experiences in this work and some of the motifs we've talked about already? Is there anything that comes to mind for you?
I can only think of Charles Tart, you know, and there's this beautiful article in one of the compendiums, I think, that you put together, or I don't remember exactly the title of the book, but he was talking about, you know, these windows to mystical experience that then are not implemented. Basically, how he could see that for himself, and he quit like taking psychedelics at some point, right? Because he said he had enough to integrate for the rest of his life. You know? And he better just stay in a spiritual practice to just try to put something, you know, in place there. And he was talking about like what he was seeing around also in the field for other people. So if I always remember him in that way, like how necessary. I agree with him how necessary it is to have practices to sustain, values to go, in order to do the integration of those. I also wanted, you know, when you sent that question before, in what I have seen when there is unitive experiences, is when the person is coming down back, you know, to reality, there are normally certain signs and cues about how to do the integration of that experience and in the experience itself. So in that way, kind of like the experience, that's my experience of accompanying people. Within the experience itself, there is the wisdom for implementation. though that also needs to be supported, you know? And so the question that you're asking is like, what are frameworks that we need to put there in order to, and I don't know if there are frameworks that need to be there, structures and reference. I know that there are practices and rituals and habits and values, right? And that there is a movement that maybe comes from the outside, but I tend to see that like coming from within and emerging from the experience. So how do we take that same wisdom emerging in that unity of experience when we come down to just continue?
Big question.
It's a big question.
You want to address it?
I don't think I can.
Any last word before we start taking questions from our wonderful audience?
So there's a question of non-duality and having a taste of non-duality. There's the matter of, somebody said entwinement. These things get worked out, they get integrated, we learn our lessons, we skin our knees, the knees heal due to engagement with other people. In some cultures long ago, that came from a culture, I think you said. We live in a very fractured culture, a very fractured time right now, where you kind of can't do that with most of the culture. Most of the culture is not signed up to that practice. So if I try to think anew, what would a community look like that has at least occasional access to non-duality and is sufficiently entangled that over the course of months and years and generations they can make good on what was seen? The word that comes to mind is church, or temple, or mosque. There's lots of definitions or understandings of the word religion, and one that's very appealing to me does not necessarily include the words dogma or creed. It's simply a group of people who are signed up to the program of long-term entanglement in order to make good on what emerges in these big experiences. I wish more people in the world had a good church.